The water hit my back door before I even heard the rain. That's the sentence that still echoes in my head every time I think about that night. Because it wasn't just water, it was pressure, weight, movement that felt deliberate, like something had been sent straight at my house. It was 3:12 a.m. when the first thud rattled the glass, a dull, heavy slap followed by a low, constant roar that didn't belong to a normal Texas storm. I remember sitting up in bed, the air already thick with that damp, earthy smell, mud and runoff, not fresh rain, and thinking something was wrong before my feet even touched the floor. When I opened the bedroom door, cold air rushed in from the hallway, carrying that same scent, stronger now, mixed with something metallic, like wet concrete and rust. The floorboards felt damp under my bare feet, just enough to make my stomach tighten. I moved faster then, heart pounding, each step echoing louder than it should have in the silence of the house. By the time I reached the living room, I could hear it clearly, the sound of water moving, not dripping, not leaking, but flowing. A steady, forceful current pressing against the walls like a river that didn't belong there. I flipped on the porch light and pulled back the curtain, and that's when everything snapped into focus. My backyard wasn't a yard anymore. It was a moving sheet of dark water, rippling under the yellow glow, carrying leaves, branches, bits of debris that twisted and spun like they'd been picked up from somewhere upstream. The fence line was barely visible, half submerged, and the ground I'd spent 2 years grading and leveling had vanished under at least 8 inches of runoff. But here's the part that didn't make sense. It hadn't rained that hard. Not enough for this. I'd lived on this land long enough to know how it behaved in a storm. I knew where the water pooled, where it drained, how the soil absorbed the first inch like a sponge before anything even thought about flowing. This wasn't that. This was too fast, too concentrated, like someone had opened a gate and pointed it straight at my property. I stepped outside, the cold biting instantly, jeans soaking through at the cuffs as I walked down the porch steps. The water was already creeping toward the foundation, inching forward, in slow, steady waves that lapped against the concrete with a hollow, rhythmic sound. I crouched down, running my hand through it, feeling the temperature, the grit, the direction. And that's when my chest tightened for a completely different reason. The flow wasn't random. It had a path, a clear, consistent direction coming from the north side, straight from the edge where my property met Willowbrook Estates. I followed it with my eyes, tracing the current backward, watching how it cut across the grass in a clean line, like it had been guided, like it had been engineered. The realization hit me harder than the cold. This wasn't just runoff. This was redirected stormwater. Someone had taken everything that should have spread out across their perfectly manicured HOA streets and funneled it into one place. My place. I stood there for a second, listening to the low hum of water pushing through grass and soil, smelling the sharp edge of disturbed earth, and I felt that familiar shift in my head, the one that happens when confusion turns into calculation. Because here's the thing they didn't know. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and for the last 12 years, I've designed flood control systems for a living. I know what water does when you force it to move. I know how pressure builds, how elevation changes everything, how a single bad decision upstream can destroy everything downstream. And as I watched that current carve its way across my land, I knew this wasn't an accident. This was design. I turned back toward the house, already thinking in measurements and flow rates, already mapping out what I was seeing in real time, when another surge rolled through, stronger this time, pushing the waterline closer to the porch by another inch. I looked up toward the dark outline of the neighborhood beyond the tree line, where the streetlights glowed faintly through the rain, and I realized something else. They hadn't just redirected the water. They'd counted on me not noticing until it was too late. And that's when I knew this wasn't over yet. I did not grab a towel or a phone. I grabbed a flashlight and my boots, because somewhere in the back of my mind, the part trained by 12 years of watching water behave under pressure, I already knew this was not a moment for panic. It was a moment for observation. The beam cut through the darkness as I stepped off the porch again, the light catching ripples and floating debris that should have never been there, and I forced myself to slow down, to look instead of react. That is something my father taught me long before I ever touched a civil engineering textbook. Measure twice, move once. He used to say it while standing over uneven ground with a shovel in his hands, the smell of fresh dirt thick in the air, the Texas sun baking everything into something solid and permanent. This land, these few acres just outside the city limits, was not some impulse purchase for me. It was the first thing I bought after my father passed, after I spent years working projects that belonged to other people, fixing problems for clients who never saw the long nights or the calculations behind the scenes. I wanted something that was mine, something quiet, something I could shape the right way from the ground up. When I bought this place 2 years ago, it was uneven, neglected, full of shallow dips that collected water after even a moderate storm. I spent months regrading it myself, running string lines, checking elevations down to fractions of an inch, making sure runoff moved naturally toward the creek at the far edge of the property where it belonged. I installed a small drainage swale along the northern boundary, subtle enough to blend into the landscape, but precise enough to handle anything a normal storm could bring. Normal being the key word, because what I was standing in now was not normal. I walked toward that northern edge, boots sinking slightly into the softened ground, the flashlight beam bouncing with each step. The closer I got, the louder it became. That low, continuous rush, like a distant highway, only it was right there in front of me. And then I saw it. The line where my property met Willowbrook Estates had changed. What used to be a gentle slope was now a defined channel, cut clean and deliberate, directing water straight through a narrow opening between two sections of newly installed drainage pipe. Corrugated metal, maybe 18 inches in diameter, partially buried but unmistakable. The water was pouring out of it in a steady, forceful stream, feeding directly into my land like a fire hose pointed at everything I had built. I crouched down again, shining the light into the mouth of the pipe, watching the flow pattern, the velocity, the way debris shot out in bursts that told me there was more volume behind it than what I was seeing on the surface. This was not just surface runoff. This was collected flow, concentrated, managed, and then redirected. I stood up slowly, the cold water now halfway up my boots, and turned toward the faint outline of Willowbrook beyond the trees. I had seen construction trucks up there a few weeks ago, grading equipment, survey flags. I had assumed they were working on internal drainage improvements, something to keep their streets from flooding during heavy storms. That is what homeowners associations like theirs usually prioritize. Clean curbs, dry sidewalks, no standing water to ruin the look of a perfectly maintained neighborhood. What they do not advertise is where that water goes when it leaves their system. My jaw tightened as the pieces started locking together in my head, one after another, like a set of blueprints I had not realized I was reading until now. They had reworked their drainage, increased efficiency, captured more flow, and instead of dispersing it responsibly, they had found the lowest adjacent point outside their boundaries. My land. I could almost see the meeting in my head. Someone pointing at a map. Someone saying it would be fine, that it would disperse naturally, that it was outside their jurisdiction. The kind of decision made in a clean office, far away from the smell of mud and the sound of water eating away at soil in real time. I stepped back, sweeping the flashlight across the channel again, memorizing every detail, every angle, every sign of fresh work. Because once you see something like this, you cannot unsee it. And once you understand it, you cannot pretend it was accidental. Another surge pushed through the pipe, stronger than the last, sending a wave across the ground that crept even closer to the house. And I knew I was no longer just dealing with a problem I could fix quietly on my own. By sunrise, the rain had stopped, but the damage had not. The air outside felt heavy, thick with that lingering scent of wet soil and something sharper underneath, like freshly disturbed clay that had no business being exposed. I stood on the back porch with a cup of coffee I had not touched, watching the water settle into slow, shallow movement across what used to be my yard. In the early light, everything looked worse. The clean grading lines I had spent months perfecting were gone, replaced by uneven channels carved overnight. The grass lay flattened in long streaks, all pointing in the same direction like evidence that did not need words. And that pipe on the north boundary, now clearly visible in daylight, sat there like it had always belonged, as if someone expected me to accept it without question. I did not. I set the mug down and walked the perimeter again, slower this time, documenting everything. My phone camera clicked steadily as I captured angles, flow patterns, the exact positioning of that drainage pipe relative to my property line. The metal was new, still clean in places where the soil had not fully coated it. and the surrounding ground showed clear signs of recent excavation. This had not been here a month ago. I would have seen it. I notice things like that. It is part of how I work, part of how I have always worked. You do not spend years designing systems that depend on inches and slope without training your eyes to catch anything that does not belong. By the time I reached the far corner, I could hear voices drifting through the trees from Willowbrook. Morning activity. Cars starting, garage doors opening, the distant hum of a neighborhood waking up behind perfectly aligned fences and freshly painted mailboxes. I wiped my hands on my jeans and headed toward the access path that led up to their side. The ground grew firmer as I climbed, the water thinning out the closer I got to their property line, which told me exactly what I already suspected. They were dry, completely dry. When I stepped out onto their street, it was like crossing into a different world. Smooth pavement, clean curbs, no standing water anywhere, not even a puddle. The storm that had pushed 8 inches of runoff through my land had somehow left their neighborhood untouched. That alone would have been enough to raise questions, but it was the details that confirmed it. Fresh concrete around storm drains, new grates installed at regular intervals, subtle grading along the sidewalks that funneled water efficiently toward collection points. It was all textbook, clean, professional, and intentional. I followed the line of drains with my eyes, tracing where the water would go once it entered the system, mapping it in my head the same way I would on a job site. Everything pointed toward the northern edge, toward me. That is when I saw her. Diane Whitmore stood across the street, just outside a large 2-story house with a white SUV parked in the driveway. She held a clipboard in one hand and a coffee cup in the other, dressed like she was about to run a meeting instead of inspect a neighborhood after a storm. Her posture was straight, controlled, the kind of confidence that comes from being used to people agreeing with you. She noticed me within seconds. Her eyes moved from my boots, still damp and stained with mud, to my face, then back toward the direction I had come from. There was no surprise there, no confusion, just a small, polite smile that did not reach her eyes. She walked over at an unhurried pace, heels clicking lightly against the pavement, each step measured. Up close, I could see the details people always mention about someone like her. Perfect hair, clean lines, that faint scent of expensive perfume that somehow cut through the morning air. Everything about her said control. "Good morning," she said, her voice smooth, practiced. "Quite a storm last night." I nodded once, keeping my tone even. It was not the storm that brought me here. Her smile held for a second longer, then shifted just enough to acknowledge that she understood exactly what I meant. She took a sip from her cup, then glanced briefly toward the storm drains lining the street before looking back at me. "We recently completed some improvements to our drainage infrastructure," she said. "It helps prevent flooding in the community." The way she said community made it clear she did not mean mine. I let a few seconds pass, just enough to make the silence uncomfortable. "And where does all that water go, Diane?" Her name landed exactly the way I intended it to. Familiar enough to show I had done my homework, direct enough to remove any pretense. She did not flinch. If anything, her posture straightened slightly, as if she had been waiting for the question. "It disperses naturally," she replied, her tone unchanged. "All work was completed. Within regulation." Regulation. That word hung there between us, clean and simple on the surface, but carrying a weight that I understood better than she probably expected. Because regulations are not suggestions. They are precise, measurable, and very easy to verify if you know where to look. I glanced past her, back toward the line of drains, then toward the edge of the neighborhood where I knew that pipe connected to my land. Then I looked back at her, holding her gaze just long enough to let her know this was not going to be a casual conversation. Because if everything was within regulation, there would be nothing to hide. And something about the way she smiled told me there was. I did not respond to her right away because I wanted to hear how far she would go without being challenged, and people like Diane always fill silence with confidence when they think they are in control. She took another slow sip of her coffee, her eyes steady, almost bored, like this was just another routine conversation she had handled 100 times before. "You have to understand," she continued, adjusting the papers on her clipboard, "modern drainage systems are designed to improve overall community resilience. We cannot have standing water damaging property values or creating hazards." The phrasing was careful, polished, built to sound reasonable. But I heard what she was not saying. I heard the part where their problem had been moved, not solved. I nodded once, glancing down the street again, taking in the perfectly dry pavement, the clean lines of the curbs, the absence of any evidence that a storm had even passed through here. Meanwhile, 8 inches of water had cut through my land overnight. I looked back at her, and your solution was to send it somewhere else. Her smile tightened just enough to register the shift in tone. The system disperses water through approved channels, she replied, her voice still calm, but now carrying a slight edge. Everything was reviewed and signed off by the county. There it was again. That word. Approved. Signed off. As if paperwork could change the direction of gravity. I stepped a little closer, not aggressive, just enough to close the distance between us, and lowered my voice so it stayed between the two of us. You routed concentrated stormwater into a single outflow point that empties directly onto my property. That is not dispersion. That is redirection. For the first time, something flickered behind her eyes. Not fear. Not yet. Just calculation. She shifted her weight slightly, adjusting her stance, and gave a small, almost dismissive shake of her head. If you have concerns, you are welcome to submit them through the proper channels, she said. The board reviews all external complaints during scheduled sessions. External. The word landed heavier than the others. It told me exactly how she saw this. Not as a problem to solve, but as an inconvenience to manage. A line drawn between her neighborhood and everything outside it, including me. I let out a slow breath, the cool morning air still carrying that faint scent of wet concrete from their new installations, and for a moment I considered how many times she had used that exact response on other people. How many times it had worked. Then I nodded again, like I was accepting it. All right, I said simply. I will do that. Her posture relaxed just a fraction, just enough to confirm she thought the conversation was over. She gave a polite smile, the kind you use when you expect compliance, and turned slightly as if she was ready to move on to whatever came next on her list. That was when I added, almost casually, I will also be requesting the full drainage plans and elevation reports submitted for this project. That stopped her. Not dramatically. Not enough for anyone else to notice if they had been watching from a distance. But I saw it. The pause. The slight delay before she turned back to face me fully. Those documents are on file with the county, she said, her tone still controlled but no longer as smooth as before. They are public record. Exactly, I replied. Which means it should be easy to confirm everything was done within regulation. The word hung there again, but this time it felt different. Sharper. More specific. I could see the shift happening now, subtle but real. The confidence was still there, but it was no longer effortless. Because this was no longer just a homeowner complaining about water. This was someone who understood the system she was relying on. She gave a small nod, tighter than before, then stepped back, creating just enough space to re-establish her control of the interaction. I am sure you will find everything in order, she said. Of course you are, I answered. Because if it was not, this would be a very different conversation. For a second, neither of us moved. The morning around us continued like nothing had changed. A car drove past at the end of the street. A garage door closed somewhere behind me. The normal rhythm of a neighborhood that had no idea what had just started. Then she turned away without another word, heels tapping against the pavement as she walked back toward her house. Her posture still straight, still composed, but just a fraction faster than before. I watched her go, then turned back toward the edge of the neighborhood, toward the line where their perfect drainage system ended and my flooded land began. The air felt different now. Not just damp, but charged, like the moment before a second storm rolls in. Because this was no longer about water alone. This was about decisions, signatures, and the exact path those choices had carved through my property overnight. And as I stood there, mapping it out in my head, I realized something else. If they had done everything by the book, there would be nothing to worry about. But if they had not, then what they built to protect their neighborhood might be the very thing that exposes them. I filed the complaint that same afternoon, and I did it the way I handle everything that matters, methodically, documented, and impossible to ignore. The county office smelled like old paper and recycled air, the kind of place where time moves slower than it should, where people assume problems will fade if they sit long enough in a stack of forms. I did not give them that chance. I submitted photographs, measurements, timestamps, and a written statement outlining exactly what had changed, where the new outflow point was located, and how the redirected flow exceeded normal surface runoff behavior. I kept my language precise, technical, stripped of anything emotional, because this was not about how I felt. It was about what could be proven. The clerk behind the counter barely looked up as she stamped the documents, her expression neutral in that practiced way that says she has seen everything and expects none of it to matter. "You will hear back within 10 to 15 business days," she said, sliding the receipt toward me like the outcome was already decided. 10 to 15 days. I nodded, took the paper, and walked out knowing exactly what that meant. Delay. Distance. Time for the system to protect itself. Back at the property, the ground had started to dry in patches, but the damage remained clear. The channels carved by the water had hardened into shallow trenches, each one marking the path that flow had taken as it cut through soil that was never meant to carry that volume. I walked them again, slower this time, measuring slopes with my eye, noting where the current had accelerated, where it had pooled, where it had forced its way toward the foundation before finally spreading out. Every detail mattered, because every detail told a story about how the system upstream was behaving. By the second day, I received my first response. Not from the county, from the Homeowners Association. The envelope was thick, the paper inside heavier than it needed to be, the kind of presentation designed to feel official before you even read the first line. I opened it standing at my kitchen counter, the faint smell of ink still fresh, and scanned the contents quickly. It was not an acknowledgement. It was a warning. Unauthorized interference with community infrastructure is prohibited. It read in language that tried to sound legal without actually saying anything enforceable. Any attempts to alter, obstruct, or redirect drainage systems connected to Willowbrook Estates may result in penalties and further action. I let out a quiet breath, folding the letter once and setting it down beside the sink. I had not touched their system, not even close. But that was not the point. The point was control. Establish the narrative early. Frame the problem before anyone else could define it. I stepped outside again, the air warmer now, the sun pulling moisture out of the ground and leaving behind that sharp, dusty smell of drying clay. The pipe at the northern boundary sat exactly where it had the night before, silent now, but still carrying a faint trace of moisture along its edges. I crouched beside it, running my fingers along the metal, feeling the smooth curve, the precise angle at which it had been installed. This was not careless work. Someone had measured this, calculated it, approved it, and that meant there were records, plans, permits, signatures. The things Diane had told me were all in order. I stood up and looked back toward the house, toward the lines where the water had nearly reached the porch, and I felt that same shift again, the one that happens when the first approach fails and something deeper takes its place. Because the complaint I filed was not going to move fast enough. The letter I received made that clear. They were already positioning themselves, already preparing to dismiss this as a minor issue or shift responsibility somewhere else. And if I waited for the system to correct itself, I would be dealing with the next storm before anything changed. I walked inside, pulled out my laptop, and opened a blank folder on my desktop. Then I started building something else. Not a complaint, not a request, a record. Every photo, every measurement, every observation from the moment the water hit my door. I added timestamps, notes, comparisons to standard flow expectations, anything that would make it impossible to reduce this to a simple misunderstanding. Because if they wanted to play this through official channels, I was going to meet them there. But I was not going to rely on their timeline. The sun dipped lower as the day wore on, casting longer shadows across the yard, shadows that followed the same paths the water had carved, as if the land itself was holding onto the memory of what had happened. I stood at the edge of the property again, looking at that pipe, at the quiet neighborhood beyond it, and I realized something that settled deep in my chest. They thought this would stay small, contained, managed like everything else they controlled. But the way that water moved told a different story, and the next time it rained, it would not be a theory anymore. The second storm came 3 days later, and this time I was ready before the first drop even hit the roof. The sky had that heavy, low-ceiling look by late afternoon, the kind that turns everything a shade darker than it should be, and the air felt thick enough to taste. I had already walked the property twice that morning, checking the channels, marking new stakes along the flow path, and setting up 2 cameras facing the northern boundary where the pipe sat waiting. Not if, when, because systems like that do not fail quietly, and they do not pause just because someone filed paperwork. By the time the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the horizon, I was already standing on the porch, watching the tree line at the edge of Willowbrook, waiting for the exact moment the system upstream would activate under load. The rain started slow, a light tapping against the roof, soft enough that anyone else might have thought it was nothing. But I watched the ground instead of the sky. I watched how the first drops hit the soil, how they disappeared almost instantly into earth that was still recovering from the last surge. The smell rose up again, wet clay and grass, familiar but sharper this time, like the land was already bracing for what it knew was coming. 10 minutes passed, then 15. The rainfall increased, steady now, but still nowhere near what would normally produce runoff on its own. And then I heard it. Not the rain. The pipe. A low, hollow rush building behind the tree line, growing louder by the second, like water being pushed through something too narrow to contain it comfortably. I stepped off the porch, boots already laced, and moved toward the boundary as the sound intensified. The first surge hit exactly the same way it had before. Sudden, focused. A burst of dark water shooting out of the pipe with force that had nothing to do with the gentle rain falling overhead. It slammed into the ground and spread fast, following the same carved paths from the previous storm, only deeper now, faster, more aggressive in the way it moved across the land. I checked my watch out of habit, noting the time, then looked back at the pipe, watching the flow stabilize into a continuous stream. This was not incidental runoff. This was collection discharge. Somewhere upstream, their system had gathered everything from streets, driveways, rooftops, and funneled it into this single point. And now it was happening again, exactly the way I had predicted. I moved back toward the porch, grabbing my tablet from the small table near the door, pulling up the live feed from the cameras I had set earlier. The footage showed it clearly. The moment the pipe activated, the volume increase, the direction of flow, clean, undeniable visual evidence that this was not natural dispersion. This was engineered concentration. The rain picked up slightly, but even then, the difference was obvious. What fell from the sky was nothing compared to what poured out of that pipe. I stepped back out into the yard, letting the water soak into my boots as I walked the same line again, this time with a different focus. I was not just observing anymore. I was measuring behavior, velocity, spread rate, the way the current accelerated once it hit the steeper section near the center of the property. I crouched again near one of the deeper channels, watching how the water cut into the edges, pulling small pieces of soil along with it, reshaping the land in real time. This was exactly what regulations are designed to prevent. Concentrated discharge without proper mitigation. No retention basin. No energy dissipation. Just force directed at the nearest available exit point. My exit point. I stood up slowly, wiping my hands on my jeans, and turned toward Willowbrook again. Through the rain, I could see the faint glow of streetlights reflecting off dry pavement, the same way it had before. Their system was working perfectly for them. No standing water. No visible impact. Just clean streets and controlled flow that disappeared the moment it left their boundary. The contrast was almost perfect. Too perfect. I walked back toward the house, checking the distance between the advancing waterline and the foundation, noting how much closer it was getting this time compared to the last storm. Another few inches, and it would start pooling where it should never reach. That thought settled in quietly, not as panic, but as confirmation. This was escalating. Exactly the way systems do when they are pushed beyond what they were designed to handle downstream. I stepped onto the porch again, rain tapping harder now against the roof, and looked out over the yard that was slowly turning into something else entirely. Not because of the storm, because of what had been done upstream. I glanced back at the tablet, at the recorded footage already saved, time-stamped, clear enough to stand on its own in any room that mattered. Then I looked back toward that pipe, still pouring, still feeding a problem someone else thought they had solved. And as the water crept another inch closer to the house, I realized something that made everything sharper. They had not just created a drainage system. They had created a pattern. And patterns, once proven, are very hard to defend. By the time the rain eased off that night, I was no longer thinking about water as a problem. I was thinking about it as evidence. The yard looked worse than before. Deeper channels now, sharper edges, The soil stripped in places where the flow had accelerated beyond what any natural runoff would ever create. And I stood there in the damp air, letting the silence settle back in after the storm, listening to the last thin trickles draining toward the far edge of the property. Everything I needed was right in front of me. I just had to prove it in a way no one could ignore. I went inside, changed into dry clothes, and sat down at my desk with the footage pulled up on the screen, replaying it frame by frame. The moment the pipe activated, the surge pattern, the delay between rainfall and discharge. That delay was the first crack in their story. In a natural system, water responds immediately to rainfall in that area. What I was seeing was lag time, which meant storage upstream, collection points, retention before release. That alone told me their system was holding water and then pushing it out in controlled bursts, which meant design, not coincidence. I paused the footage and pulled up a map of the area, overlaying property lines and elevation data I already had saved from when I first bought the land. The slope from Willowbrook into my property was minimal, barely enough to carry dispersed runoff under normal conditions. But when concentrated, when forced through a defined outflow, it became something else entirely. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen, and let the pieces come together the way they always do when something starts to make sense. They had not just installed a better drainage system. They had altered the flow path, redirected it, increased volume at a single exit point without accounting for downstream impact. And if they had done that, there had to be a design plan that either ignored or misrepresented what would happen beyond their boundary. The next morning, I drove back up to the county office, this time heading past the front desk and straight toward the records department. The room smelled like paper and dust, rows of filing cabinets stretching along the walls, each one filled with years of permits, plans, and approvals that most people never think about until something goes wrong. I gave them the project name, Willowbrook Estates Drainage Improvement, and waited while the clerk pulled the files. It took longer than it should have, not because they could not find it, but because they were deciding how much of it I was allowed to see. When the folder finally landed on the counter, it was thinner than I expected. Too thin for a project that had clearly involved excavation, pipe installation, and system redesign. I opened it slowly, scanning the contents. Basic site plans, general drainage layout, approval signatures. Everything looked clean at first glance. Too clean. I flipped through the pages again, slower this time, paying attention to what was not there. No detailed downstream impact analysis. No flow rate projections beyond their property line. No mention of adjacent land conditions. That was not just an oversight. That was a gap. And gaps like that do not happen by accident in projects that pass through multiple levels of review. I looked up at the clerk, who was pretending not to watch me, and then back down at the file. This was the version they wanted on record. The version that showed compliance without showing consequences. I took photos of every page, careful, thorough, making sure nothing was missed, then closed the folder and handed it back. On the drive home, the sky was clear again, sunlight cutting across the land in a way that made everything look calm, almost normal if you ignored the scars left behind. But I did not ignore them. I pulled into the driveway and stepped out, the dry air carrying that faint trace of dust where the ground had already started to harden again. I walked straight to the northern boundary, stopping in front of that pipe, and looked at it with a different understanding now. It was not just a piece of infrastructure. It was the end of a system that had been designed to hide its impact. Upstream, everything looked perfect. Downstream, everything told the truth. I crouched down again, brushing away a thin layer of dirt from the edge of the installation, exposing the clean line where new work met old ground. Someone had signed off on this knowing exactly where it would lead, or they had chosen not to look closely enough to see it. Either way, the result was the same. I stood up, wiping my hands, and turned back toward the house, already thinking ahead, not about what they said, but about what they left out. Because if the official plans did not show the full picture, then somewhere there had to be a version that did. The version they wanted on record was clean, but clean does not mean complete, and that difference is where most systems start to fall apart if you know where to look. I spent that afternoon going back through everything I had collected, not just the footage and measurements from my property, but the documents from the county, laying them side by side on my desk like pieces of a puzzle that did not quite fit. The sunlight coming through the window caught the edges of the paper, highlighting the gaps more than the information itself, and I focused on those gaps because they told me what had been avoided. No downstream analysis meant they either did not calculate impact beyond their boundary or chose not to include it. No flow rate projections meant they did not want to show how much water that system was actually moving. And the absence of any reference to adjacent land conditions meant they treated everything outside Willowbrook as if it did not exist. That is not how drainage design works. Not if it is done correctly. I opened my laptop and pulled up the raw elevation data again, overlaying it with the basic layout from their submitted plans, adjusting the scale until the alignment became clear. The pipe on my boundary was not just an endpoint. It was the lowest engineered exit in their entire system. Everything upstream, every street, every gutter, every collection point had been designed to guide water toward that location. That was not a coincidence. That was intent. I leaned forward, tracing the path with my finger across the screen, and then I noticed something else. The grading lines on their plan did not fully match the actual slope I had measured on site. It was subtle, the kind of discrepancy most people would never catch, but enough to change how water would behave under pressure. Their plan showed a gradual dispersion near the boundary. What I had on my land was a concentrated release. That meant one of two things. Either the plan was incomplete, or the construction did not follow the plan they submitted. Both were problems. I sat back and let that settle in, the quiet hum of the room filling the space as everything connected into something more solid. If they had built it differently than approved, that was a violation. If they had submitted a plan that did not reflect reality, that was something else entirely. Either way, it meant the official record was not telling the truth. The question was where the real version existed. I grabbed my keys and headed back out, the late afternoon heat already rising off the ground, carrying that dry, dusty smell that comes after water has stripped moisture from the surface too quickly. The drive into Willowbrook felt different now, not because anything had changed on the surface, but because I knew what was underneath it. I parked along the same street as before and walked toward the line of storm drains, moving slower this time, studying details I had overlooked in the first pass. The concrete around some of the newer installations had faint markings, contractor identifiers pressed into the surface before it dried. Small, easy to miss, but enough to give me a name. I crouched down, brushing away a thin layer of dirt to read it more clearly. It matched a local civil contractor I recognized, a company that handled mid-sized municipal projects. That was my next step, because contractors keep records that never make it into public files. Field adjustments, revised calculations, the things that happen when plans meet reality. I stood up and walked a little further, following the line again, this time not just mapping where the water went, but how the system had been physically built, the angles of the inlets, the spacing between drains, the slight variations that suggested on-site decisions rather than strict adherence to a fixed plan. All of it pointed to one thing. This system had evolved during construction, and when that happens, the original documents rarely tell the full story. I turned back toward my truck, the quiet hum of the neighborhood continuing around me like nothing was out of place, like everything was exactly how it should be. That was the illusion, the part they expected everyone to accept without question. But systems leave traces, even when they are designed not to. And I had just found the first one that did not match what they claimed. I opened the door, paused for a second with my hand on the frame, and looked back down the street one more time, at the drains, at the clean pavement, at the order they had created on the surface. Because somewhere between those lines and the pipe on my land, something had changed. And whatever that change was, it had not made it into the file I was given. I did not go home right away. Instead, I drove straight to the contractor's office while the details were still sharp in my head, because timing matters when you are trying to catch something before it disappears into paperwork. The building sat off a 2-lane road just outside town, a low structure with sun-faded signage and a gravel lot that crunched under my tires as I pulled in. The air outside carried that familiar mix of dust and diesel, the kind of place where real work happens, not the polished version you see in approved documents. Inside, the reception area was simple, functional, a desk, a few chairs, the faint hum of a ceiling fan moving warm air in slow circles. The woman behind the desk looked up as I walked in, her expression neutral but attentive. I gave her the project name, the subdivision, and the contractor stamp I had seen pressed into the concrete. She hesitated for a second, not enough to be obvious, but enough for me to notice. Then she nodded and disappeared into the back. That pause told me I was in the right place. A few minutes later, a man stepped out, mid-40s, work boots, button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled just enough to show he was not just sitting behind a desk all day. He introduced himself as Mark Ellison, project supervisor. His handshake was firm, his eyes direct, but there was something measured in the way he looked at me, like he was already trying to place what I knew before deciding how much to say. I kept it simple. I told him who I was, what I had seen, and where the discharge point ended up. I did not accuse. I described. That is the difference between a conversation that closes doors and one that opens them. He listened without interrupting, his expression tightening just slightly when I mentioned the pipe location on my boundary. When I finished, he let out a slow breath and glanced toward the back office before looking at me again. We built what was approved, he said, his tone careful. Field conditions required some adjustments, but everything was within spec. Within spec is a phrase that can mean a lot of things depending on how it is used, and the way he said it told me it was doing more work than the words themselves. I nodded, not challenging him yet, and instead asked a different question. Were those adjustments documented? That was when the silence shifted. Not long, just enough to register. He looked down briefly, then back up, and I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Because that question does not have a simple answer when the record is not complete. We keep internal logs for field changes, he said finally. Not everything makes it into the final submission if it does not affect core compliance. Core compliance. Another phrase that sounds solid until you look at what it leaves out. I took a small step closer, lowering my voice slightly. Redirecting concentrated flow onto adjacent property is not a minor adjustment, Mark. That affects compliance. This time, he did not answer right away. The ceiling fan hummed above us, the sound filling the space between words, and I could see the tension settle into his shoulders just enough to confirm what I already suspected. He was not surprised by what I was saying. He was deciding how much he could acknowledge without stepping into something bigger. Finally, he nodded once, slow, almost reluctant. There were concerns raised during construction, he said, about downstream impact. They were addressed at the time. Addressed how? I kept my tone steady, not pushing, just asking. He exhaled again, this time a little heavier, and glanced toward the back office once more before speaking. We were told the discharge point was outside the HOA boundary and would disperse naturally. That was the directive. Directive. That word landed harder than the others. Because directives come from somewhere specific. Someone signs off on them. Someone makes the decision to move forward despite concerns. I held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded. Do you still have those logs? Another pause. Shorter this time, but clearer. I can check, he said. They are archived. It might take a day or two. That was enough. I thanked him, kept it professional, and turned to leave, the gravel crunching under my boots again as I stepped back into the late afternoon heat. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the lot, and I stood there for a moment, letting everything settle into place. Concerns raised. Adjustments made. Directive given. None of that was in the file I had been shown. I got into my truck and sat there with my hands on the wheel, looking out at the quiet road ahead, replaying his words in my head. Because what he had just confirmed was not just a discrepancy. It was a decision that had been made knowing exactly what it would do downstream. And if those internal logs said what I thought they might, then the version of the project on record was only part of the story. I did not wait for those logs to come to me, because waiting was exactly what they were counting on, and by the time something moves through the system at their pace, the urgency fades and the damage becomes easier to dismiss. Instead, I went back to my desk that night and started building something they would not expect. Not a complaint, not a request, a model. I pulled up the elevation data again, this time layering it with rainfall records from the last two storms, actual numbers, inches per hour, duration, accumulation, everything I could pull from local weather stations. Then I matched that against what I had recorded on my property, the volume coming out of that pipe, the timing, the spread. The numbers did not line up the way they should have if this were natural runoff. They were too high, too concentrated, too delayed. That delay was the key. It meant storage upstream, which meant controlled release. And controlled release means design responsibility. I leaned forward, adjusting the parameters, running the calculations the same way I would for any client project, removing guesswork, stripping it down to physics and flow. Water does not care about boundaries or paperwork. It follows gravity, pressure, and path. And when you force it into a path, you own the consequences of where it goes next. The simulation on my screen started to take shape, a simple visual at first, then more detailed as I refined it, showing exactly how their system would behave under different storm intensities. Light rain, moderate storm, heavy downpour. In every scenario, the same pattern emerged. Accumulation upstream, delayed release, concentrated discharge at the lowest exit point. My exit point. I sat back for a moment, letting the hum of the room settle around me, and watched the model play through again. This was no longer just observation. This was proof. Not the kind that depends on interpretation, but the kind that shows cause and effect in a way that cannot be easily dismissed. I saved the files, backed them up, then opened a new document and started outlining something else. A report. Clear, structured, built the way regulators expect to see it, with data, visuals, and conclusions that tie directly to established standards. I referenced stormwater management guidelines, downstream impact requirements, energy dissipation expectations, all the things that should have been addressed in their original submission but were not. Every section pointed to the same conclusion. The system as built was transferring risk downstream without mitigation. I paused for a second, fingers resting on the keyboard, and thought about Diane standing there with her clipboard, talking about regulation like it was a shield. Then I kept typing, because the more complete this became, the less room there would be for interpretation. By the time I finished the first draft, the sky outside had gone dark again, not with storm clouds this time, but with the quiet stillness of a clear night. I stepped outside, the air cooler now, carrying only a faint trace of the earlier moisture, and walked to the edge of the property one more time. The pipe sat silent, but I could see it differently now, not just as a physical outlet, but as the endpoint of a system I now understood completely. Upstream control, downstream impact, missing documentation, field adjustments, directive decisions, all of it connected. I pulled out my phone and checked the forecast. Another system was moving in 2 days out, heavier than the last one if the projections held. I looked back at the house, then at the yard, still marked by the paths the water had carved, and then back at the pipe. Because now I had something they did not expect. Not just evidence of what had happened, but a clear demonstration of what would happen again under predictable conditions. And more importantly, why? I turned and walked back toward the porch, the boards creaking softly under my boots, already thinking about the next step. Because a report like that does not just sit on a desk. It goes somewhere specific. To people who understand what it means. People who ask questions when numbers do not match claims. I paused at the door, hand resting against the frame, and glanced once more toward the boundary where everything began. Because once that report left my hands, this would not stay contained to a single property line anymore. I sent the report the next morning before the sun had fully burned through the low haze, because timing matters when you are dealing with people who prefer problems to stay quiet. It did not go to a general inbox or a clerk who would stamp it and set it aside. It went directly to the County Engineering Review Office, addressed to the one department that deals specifically with stormwater compliance and downstream impact. I included everything: the model, the footage, the measurements, the discrepancies between the approved plans and the actual installation, and the one detail I knew would force them to pay attention: the pattern. Because a single incident can be dismissed, a repeatable pattern cannot. After I hit send, I did not sit around waiting for a response. I stepped outside, the morning air cool and still, and walked to the northern boundary again, looking at that pipe with the kind of clarity that only comes when you know exactly what you are dealing with. The ground was dry for now. The channels hardened into shallow lines that cut across the yard like a map of everything that had already happened. 2 storms. 2 identical outcomes. That was enough. Around mid-afternoon, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered without hesitation. The voice on the other end was steady, professional, the kind that does not waste time on small talk. "This is Daniel Harper with County Engineering Review," he said. "We received your submission this morning." I leaned against the porch railing, eyes still on the boundary line, and kept my voice even. "I assume you have questions." There was a brief pause, not uncertainty, but confirmation. "Your data suggests concentrated discharge beyond approved parameters," he replied. "We need to verify site conditions. When are you available?" I looked out across the yard, imagining the next storm, the next surge, the same path repeating itself with mathematical precision. I am here now, I said. There was no delay this time. We will be there within the hour. The call ended, and for the first time since this started, I felt something shift outside of my control. Not uncertainty, momentum. An hour later, 2 vehicles pulled up near the edge of my property, not inside Willowbrook, but on my side, where the problem actually existed. Daniel Harper stepped out, along with another engineer carrying a tablet and a case of field equipment. No clipboard, no casual conversation, just quiet observation as they took in the ground, the channels, the pipe, the slope. I walked them through everything, not as a complaint, but as a presentation. Timeline, measurements, flow behavior. Then I showed them the footage. The moment the pipe activated, the delay, the volume. Daniel watched it without interrupting, his expression tightening slightly as the sequence played through. When it ended, he looked back toward the pipe, then down at the ground where the water had carved its path. This was not in the submitted plan, he said quietly. I did not answer. I did not need to. He already knew. They spent the next hour taking their own measurements, checking elevations, documenting the installation, comparing what they saw to what had been approved. There was no rush in their movements, but there was focus, the kind that comes when something does not match expectations. At one point, the second engineer crouched near the pipe, running a hand along the edge just like I had, then looked up at Daniel and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. That was enough. Eventually, Daniel stood up, brushing dust from his hands, and turned toward me. We will need to inspect the upstream system, he said. This may involve a temporary suspension of their drainage operations pending review. Suspension. That word carried weight. Because if their system stopped, even temporarily, everything it was holding back would have to go somewhere else. Somewhere they had not designed for. I nodded once, keeping my reaction controlled. Understood. He looked toward Willowbrook, then back at me, and for a moment there was something in his expression that was not just professional. It was recognition. He knew what this meant. Not just for me, but for them. Because systems, like that, are not built to fail gracefully when they are interrupted. They rely on continuous operation, continuous flow. Without it, pressure builds in places no one planned for. The team packed up their equipment, thanked me briefly, and headed back to their vehicles, leaving the property as quiet as they found it. I stood there for a while after they left, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard, shadows that still followed the same paths the water had taken. Everything was still for now, calm, but not resolved. Because if they moved forward with that suspension, the next storm would not play out the same way it had before. The notice went out faster than I expected, and that alone told me how serious it had become behind the scenes. By the next afternoon, a temporary suspension order had been issued on Willowbrook's drainage system, not the entire network, but the section tied to the outflow point at my boundary. I found out the same way everyone else did, not through a letter or a phone call, but through the sudden stillness at that pipe. I walked out just after sunrise, coffee in hand, expecting to see the usual damp trace from overnight humidity, but the ground was quiet, untouched, the pipe dry for the first time since this started. No residual trickle, no delayed discharge, just silence. That was the first sign. The second came from the sky. The forecast had not changed. Another storm system was still moving in, heavier than the last two, the kind that turns streets into mirrors and pushes every drainage system to its limit. I stood at the edge of the property, looking toward Willowbrook, and for the first time, I realized they were about to experience their own design without the outlet they had been relying on. The rain started late in the afternoon, slow at first, the same way it always does, a soft tapping against the roof, barely enough to register if you were not paying attention. But I was. I watched the ground again, the same way I had before, tracking how the soil absorbed the first layer, how the air shifted, how the scent of wet grass rose and settled. Then I listened, not for the pipe this time, but for everything upstream. Within 20 minutes, the sound reached me. Not a concentrated rush, not a forced discharge, but something broader, heavier, like water spreading across surfaces that were not designed to hold it. I stepped off the porch and moved toward the boundary, stopping just short of the line where my land met theirs. Through the trees, I could see it. Water pooling along the curb lines, shallow at first, then deepening as more runoff collected with nowhere to go. The storm drains I had studied days before were still there, but without that downstream release point active, their system was holding on to more than it was designed to manage. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing most people would ignore. A few inches along the street, a slow creep toward driveways. But I knew what came next. Because water does not stop when you ask it to. It builds. It looks for the next available path. And if that path is blocked, it finds another. The rain intensified, each drop hitting harder now, faster, turning the surface of the road into a shifting layer of reflected light. I watched as the water level along the street rose another inch, then another, inch by inch, until it began to spill over the curb lines, moving into spaces that had not been part of the original plan. Lawns, sidewalk edges, the low points between houses where grading was never meant to handle concentrated flow. Their system was still working, but not the way they had intended. Without the outlet they had relied on, everything upstream was being forced to adjust in real time. I took a few steps closer, staying on my side, watching the patterns form. The same principles, the same behavior, just in reverse. Where my land had once been the lowest point receiving everything, now their streets were holding on to it, redistributing it across areas that had never been designed to carry that load. I could see movement at the far end of the block now. Garage doors opening, people stepping out, looking down at water where there had never been any before. Confusion first, then concern. It spread the same way the water did, quietly at first, then faster as more people noticed the same thing happening at the same time. I stayed where I was, not crossing the line, not saying a word, just observing as the system they trusted began to show its limits without the shortcut they had built into it. The rain continued, steady and relentless, and the water followed every rule it always does. It filled, it spread, it searched, and for the first time since this started, it was not my land carrying the consequence of their design. I glanced back at my yard, dry now except for the natural absorption that should have been there all along, then returned my attention to the neighborhood beyond the trees. Because what I was seeing was not failure. It was exposure, the kind that happens when a system is forced to operate exactly as designed, without the part that hides its impact. And as the water crept another inch higher along their street, I realized something that settled in deeper than anything before. They were about to understand the same pattern I had been watching from the beginning. By the time the rain stopped, the neighborhood did not look broken, it looked revealed. The water had not caused chaos or destruction. It had simply gone where it was always going to go once the system lost the one exit it had been relying on. Streets held shallow pools that reflected porch lights in long, wavering lines. Lawns carried thin sheets of runoff that crept toward low points between properties. Nothing catastrophic, just undeniable. I stood at the boundary as the last drops fell, the air heavy with that familiar mix of wet asphalt and cooling earth, and watched as people stepped out onto their driveways, looking down at water where there had never been any before. Some pointed, some talked, some just stood there, trying to make sense of something that did not match the image they had been sold. I recognized that feeling. It is the moment when assumption meets reality and has nowhere left to hide. The next morning, the county returned, not quietly this time. 2 additional vehicles, more equipment, more people, and a presence that made it clear this was no longer a routine inspection. Daniel Harper walked the line again, this time with others beside him, reviewing the same points, but with a different tone. Measurements were verified. Notes were taken. Photos were logged. The pipe at my boundary was marked, documented, and flagged as a non-compliant discharge point pending full review. That phrase carried more weight than anything said before. Non-compliant. It meant the system, as built, did not meet the standards it claimed to follow. And once that is established, everything connected to it comes into question. By midday, the conversation had shifted beyond my property. Notices were issued to Willowbrook's management. Requests for full documentation, including field adjustment logs, internal communications, and revised calculations that had never made it into the official file. The version of the project they had relied on was no longer enough. They were being asked for the parts they chose not to show. I saw Diane again that afternoon. Not on her street this time, but near the edge where their system met the line they had treated as invisible. She stood with 2 other people, her posture still straight, still composed, but the ease was gone. The clipboard was there, but it was no longer a symbol of control. It was something to hold on to while everything around it shifted. She noticed me, of course. Her eyes met mine for a brief moment, and in that second, there was no need for words. The conversation we had before about regulation and compliance now existed in a different context, not as a defense, but as something being examined from the outside. I gave a small nod, not out of acknowledgement, but because there was nothing left to say that had not already been proven. She looked away first. The days that followed moved quickly, faster than anything that had come before. Engineers reviewed data. Inspectors walked the system from start to finish. The contractor logs that Mark had mentioned were requested, and when they arrived, they filled in the gaps exactly where I expected them to. Notes about downstream concerns. Adjustments made to improve flow efficiency within the neighborhood. A directive to proceed with the discharge configuration based on boundary assumptions rather than impact analysis. It was all there. Not dramatic. Not hidden behind complicated language. Just clear enough to show what had been known and what had been ignored. The conclusion, when it came, was not loud or sudden. It was precise. The system required modification. Proper mitigation had to be implemented. Retention and dissipation measures had to be added before any discharge could occur beyond their boundary. In simple terms, they had to fix what they had redirected. Work began within the week. Equipment returned. Trenches were opened. A retention basin was carved into a section of land. Inside their development, designed to hold and slow water before it moved anywhere else. Energy dissipators were installed at new outlet points that no longer pointed at my property. The pipe at my boundary was sealed, not removed, but disconnected from active flow, turned into something that no longer carried the weight of their decisions. I watched it all from the same place I had stood since the beginning, the edge where their system met my land, the place where everything had first revealed itself. The next storm came quietly, almost like an afterthought. Rain fell steady, predictable, nothing unusual. I stood on the porch and watched the ground the same way I always do, tracking the way water moved, where it went, how it behaved. This time, it followed the path it was supposed to. It absorbed. It dispersed. It moved toward the creek at the far edge, exactly the way I had designed it to from the start. No surge, no delayed rush, no forced discharge from somewhere it did not belong. Just water doing what it does when no one tries to cheat the system. I walked out to the boundary one last time, the air clean, the ground stable, and looked at the pipe that had once carried everything into my land. It sat there quietly, unchanged on the outside, but completely different in what it represented. Not a problem anymore. A reminder. Because what happened here was never really about water. It was about what happens when someone decides to move a problem instead of solving it. And the truth about that kind of decision is simple. It always finds its way back.